There is one question no briefing room has answered today, and the silence around it is louder than anything said on record. Iran's foreign ministry confirmed this morning that Tehran will not send negotiators to Pakistan for the second round of talks. The ceasefire clock is already ticking toward Wednesday, yet Vance, Witkoff, and Kushner still flew to Islamabad as if the meeting were happening anyway. And China, the country underwriting Iran's economy through oil purchases, the country whose technology quietly shaped battlefield outcomes, the country that blocked every enforcement mechanism at the UN, said nothing. No comment on Iran's refusal, no reaction to the seized Iranian cargo ship moving from China, no diplomatic pressure, just silence. That silence is not empty. It is doing work, possibly more than anything Washington or Tehran has said out loud. Start with Iran's refusal, because the way it is being framed is fundamentally wrong. Most coverage paints it as stubbornness, as bad faith, as a simple refusal to cooperate. The narrative is clean and convenient. If Iran just showed up, a deal could happen. But that interpretation collapses under scrutiny. Iran is not reacting emotionally, it is calculating. And that calculation is rooted in a very specific memory from the first round of talks. 21 hours in Islamabad, the highest level direct contact between the US and Iran in decades. Senior figures across the table, mediators present, expectations high. And when it ended, Iran's side made one point absolutely clear. The issue was not capability, it was trust. Not a gap in power, but a gap in belief. That distinction matters, because from Tehran's perspective, the pattern is consistent. Agreements are reached, then reversed. Commitments are made, then adjusted. Terms shift at the final stage. Even in this current cycle, both sides moved close, very close to a deal. Then the terms changed again. Then a naval action took place during a ceasefire window. Then a vessel was intercepted and seized. Each step reinforces the same conclusion inside Iran's leadership. Words do not hold when pressure rises. So what looks like refusal from the outside is internally a learned response. Not impulsive, but conditioned. And there is another layer. Most coverage is missing entirely. The Iran you're watching is not a single actor. It is two systems operating in parallel. One wants a negotiated outcome. It understands the economic strain, the risk of escalation, the cost of prolonged conflict. The other sees compromise as weakness and escalation as leverage. These two forces are not aligned. They are actively competing. That internal conflict is happening in real time. One side signals openness to talks. The other counters with actions at sea. One opens a channel, the other undermines it within hours. The contradictions you see in public statements are not confusion. They are evidence of a struggle over direction. And this is where China's silence becomes critical, because China is not reacting to events. It is shaping the environment in which those internal Iranian decisions are made. Before today's silence, China had already played 3 decisive roles quietly, consistently, and without direct confrontation. First, it kept Iran economically alive. Even at the height of pressure, Iran's oil exports did not collapse. They adapted. Routing changed. Payment systems shifted. Volumes held. That alone alters the balance, because a country that can still move its primary resource is not under full constraint. It still has room to refuse. Second, China shielded Iran diplomatically. When enforcement measures reached international forums, they stalled. When pressure escalated, political cover remained. That protection is not loud, but it is effective. It prevents isolation from becoming absolute. Third, China influenced timing. A single call can shift decisions. A signal to open a route, to ease pressure, to stabilize flows. And when those signals align with China's interests, they are delivered. When they do not, silence takes their place. Now look at the sequence. China encourages de-escalation, Iran responds, conditions do not change, pressure resumes, a vessel tied to China is intercepted, Iran escalates again, and China says nothing. That silence is not hesitation. It is calculation. Because speaking carries cost. A public statement would expose relationships. It would raise questions about supply chains, dependencies, and strategic alignment. It would force positions into the open. Silence avoids all of that. Silence preserves flexibility. And Iran reads that silence carefully. Not as absence, but as signal. A signal that refusal is acceptable, that escalation will not break the partnership, that the economic lifeline remains intact, which leads to a simple but uncomfortable conclusion. The absence of a statement may be the most powerful statement in this entire situation. To understand why that silence matters, you have to look at what would happen if China chose the opposite path. If Beijing openly criticized the seizure of a vessel linked to its supply chain, it would immediately expose the structure it has spent years keeping opaque. It would invite scrutiny into shipping routes, payment channels, and the entire system that allows Iranian oil to move despite restrictions. That is not a small cost. That is a strategic exposure. And if China pressured Iran publicly to return to negotiations, it would inherit responsibility for whatever follows. If talks fail again, China becomes part of that failure. If Iran walks away, China is seen as unable to influence its own partner. That is a liability Beijing does not want. So it chooses the position with the lowest risk and the highest flexibility, say nothing, commit to nothing, preserve everything. But that choice creates a very specific outcome. It tells Iran that there is no immediate penalty for refusal. The oil continues to move. The diplomatic shield remains. The external pressure is not absolute. That is enough. Not comfort, not stability, but enough to hold position and wait. This is why the current situation is not drifting. It is stabilizing into a pattern. A prolonged, unresolved state where no side achieves a decisive outcome, but one side benefits more from the continuation than from the resolution. For China, a clean resolution on American terms is not ideal. A full agreement would reopen markets, reduce dependency, and rebalance influence. Iran, once reintegrated, would no longer rely on discounted sales into Chinese channels. The leverage built over years would weaken. At the same time, a visible diplomatic win for Washington would reinforce the credibility of its pressure tools. That is not a neutral outcome. An extended stalemate, however, produces a different effect. It drains resources, keeps uncertainty high, and maintains existing dependencies. Energy markets remain unstable. Alternative supply chains remain competitive, and the strategic advantage of being the primary buyer under constraint remains intact. This is the environment China is optimizing for. Not chaos, but controlled tension. Not collapse, but continuation. There is also a timing factor that cannot be ignored. A major bilateral meeting between Washington and Beijing is approaching. Every move made now is being evaluated against that horizon. Escalating publicly over a single incident risks complicating that meeting. Remaining silent avoids creating a direct confrontation before the agenda is set. So again, the calculation favors silence. Now step back and look at how this interacts with the American strategy. From Washington's perspective, the pressure campaign is working at least partially. Shipping disruptions have occurred. Economic indicators inside Iran show strain. There are signs of movement toward negotiation. Even internal contradictions within Iran's leadership suggest pressure is having an effect, and those contradictions are real. On the same day, different officials signal opposite directions. One rejects talks. Another suggests they could happen soon. This is not messaging error. It is internal division. A system under pressure does not respond uniformly. It fractures. From that view, continuing pressure makes sense. Stay present, show willingness to negotiate, maintain the narrative that the door is open. If the other side refuses, the responsibility becomes visible to the international audience. That positioning matters for whatever comes next, whether it is another round of talks or a return to escalation. There is also evidence that back-channel communication is still active. Meetings continue, mediators are engaged, signals are being sent quietly, even as public statements harden. That dual-track behavior, public resistance, private engagement, is typical in high-stakes negotiations. It allows both sides to preserve leverage while keeping options open. So the American position is not irrational. It is structured. Pressure plus presence. Constraint plus invitation. But there is a limit to that strategy, and that limit is structural, because pressure only works if the target cannot bypass it. And right now, Iran can bypass enough of it to survive. Not thrive, survive. And survival is all that is required to refuse unfavorable terms. As long as the economic channel remains partially open, the pressure never becomes absolute. It becomes manageable. Painful, but manageable. And in that space, time becomes a tool. Delay becomes a strategy. This is where the entire situation compresses into a single constraint, the external lifeline that cannot be cut. As long as that lifeline exists, the negotiation does not end. It stretches, it loops, it resets. Each round moves closer, then stalls, then resets again. Not because the deal is impossible, but because the conditions required to force a final decision are never fully met. And the country holding that lifeline has chosen not to speak at the exact moment when speaking would carry the most weight. That is not passive. That is deliberate. So what should you watch next? Not the headlines, not the slogans. Watch the signals, because the next 48 hours will reveal more than any official briefing. The first signal is China's wording. Not broad calls for peace, not recycled language about restraint, something specific, something direct about the seized vessel tied to a Chinese route. If Beijing stays vague, that tells you ambiguity still serves its interests better than confrontation. If it becomes precise, then the threshold has changed and the incident has become too significant to ignore. The second signal is contact. If China's top diplomats engage Iran again before the ceasefire deadline, that means Beijing has decided the current uncertainty now carries more cost than leverage. It would suggest that further instability threatens larger priorities, energy flows, trade conditions, summit optics, supply chain confidence. But if there is no call, no visible intervention, no pressure, then the message is equally clear. The present stalemate remains acceptable. The third signal is the only one that truly matters inside Iran, who actually wins the internal argument. Not who speaks louder in public, but which faction controls the next move. If a delegation appears despite official denials, the diplomatic camp has regained ground. That would mean the back channel is still alive and still producing results beyond public view. But if no team arrives, then the hardline faction has taken control of the moment. And once that happens, the ceasefire deadline becomes more dangerous than symbolic. Because at that point, the decision facing Washington sharpens fast. Either extend uncertainty, return to direct pressure, or accept that the talks are no longer shaping events. That is why this moment is being misunderstood. Too much attention is on the visible drama and not enough on the structural reality underneath it. The real story is not just whether Iran goes to Pakistan. It is whether Iran believes it has enough backing, enough room, and enough time to stay away. And right now, China's silence is helping create that belief. This is what major power silence does in a crisis. It changes the incentives without ever announcing them. It does not need to issue orders. It only needs to leave enough space for another actor to conclude that resistance is sustainable. And Iran is drawing exactly that conclusion. That is the deeper meaning of today. America can keep saying the framework is close. Iran can keep saying the terms are unacceptable. Mediators can keep flying between capitals. But behind all of it is a simpler force. One external power has decided that speaking now would cost more than staying quiet. And that silence has effects. It strengthens one faction inside Iran over the other. It weakens the urgency to compromise. It keeps the negotiation suspended in a zone where pressure hurts but does not break. So, no, the biggest move today was not made at a podium. It was not made on a runway. It was not made in Islamabad. It was made in the choice to say nothing. And if Tehran is reading that silence the way it almost certainly is, then China's silence may be shaping this negotiation more than any public message coming from Washington or Tehran.